All right. Well, in the interest of everybody's time, again, I just have a minute after, but we've got a full presentation this morning. Looking forward to sharing with you all that we know about the DoD's cybersecurity requirements and, of course, the risks of non-compliance. So I want to get going, and so that we have time at the end for any Q&A that we can specifically address. I'm joined this morning by Greg Thornton, our Vice President of Network and Security Services, as well as Charlie Shudo, who is our VP of Technology and Security. I'm Elizabeth Niedringhaus, President and CEO of SSE, and just wanted to give Greg and Charlie both a minute to introduce themselves.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining. Again, my name is Greg Thornton. I am the Vice President of Network and Security Services, ultimately in charge of the daily operations for the network services team to ensure that we deliver everything we promise and exceed expectations in customer service. But have spent the better part of the last year and a half working with Charlie and the rest of the team developing a solution based on NIST 800-171 and CMMC regulatory requirements, from a deep understanding to developing the solution and language that we need to ensure compliance for ourselves and for our customers. Thank you all for joining.
Great. Thank you, Greg. Charlie, good morning.
Good morning. My name is Charlie Shudo. I'm VP of Technology and Security here at SSE. I've been here 13 years. I'm responsible for compliance from a technical perspective. I lead research and development and satisfying controls and practices on a technical level for all our systems, and those include, CMMC, NIST 800-171, and NIST 800-53, which is being used in our classified systems, which we manage for our prime customer. Thanks.
All right, great. Thank you both. So just a little background for those of you on the call today that might not be familiar with SSE. Our roots go back to actually 1966, when we were founded by Susan Elliott as a woman-owned small business. She set out to really grow and evolve the business in 1983 with the advent of the personal computer. Of course, at that time, nobody knew how to use computers, so she started as a training services provider. And that quickly morphed into IT services as the corporations who we were providing training to turned to SSE to provide PC support, which grew into our network services that we provide today on a managed outsource basis to companies that we partner with. Our cybersecurity expertise, actually, we began really developing that in earnest back in 2009. As Charlie mentioned, we have several classified programs that we manage. And so that's really when we began to take seriously cybersecurity and making sure that we were securing the data and the systems across our own enterprise. Today, we're focused on the financial services sector as well as the defense sector, given, of course, the regulatory compliance requirements specifically related to IT and security. And we are 100% dependent on our quality management system for ensuring internally our systems and processes and procedures support ongoing compliance. So a little bit different look at why CMMC and SSE, again, as I mentioned and Charlie mentioned, we have this rich history of cybersecurity services. Couple that with being a defense contractor ourselves and our commercial IT managed services business, we really bring a unique combination of capabilities to help other companies who are looking at these cybersecurity requirements and looking for solutions. We're pleased to announce that we are certified as a CMMC registered provider organization. We're actually only one of two companies in Missouri with this designation. It means we have registered providers on staff, as well as we've been through the myriad of training classes that they've offered on the standards. So we're in a position to be an advisor and a consultant to companies. And of course, we've signed their professional code of conduct. So we're thrilled. This is a brand new designation. They started rolling off in the end of last year. And again, we're pleased to be just one of 2 companies in Missouri. So hopping into our agenda for today, again, I wanted to provide a little bit of background on the cybersecurity requirements that the DoD has out there, really dive into the interim final rule that came out in the 4th quarter of last year, talk about what that looks like in terms of the required self-assessments, talk you through our solution set and where we can help companies who may be looking at this as something that internally they don't feel prepared to handle themselves. We're also going to take a little bit of a dive into the unique requirements that this creates for manufacturers in the defense space. And of course, talk about planning for 2021 and steps to compliance. And as I mentioned, we intend to leave time at the end for question and answer. So setting the stage, what we're really talking about is DFARS 252.204-7012, which was under the Obama administration back actually in 2014, an executive order that mandated compliance to this NIST 800-171 standard. So what we're talking about is not new. Again, this was an executive order back in 2014. And the requirement was back then that every defense contractor meet the NIST 800-171 requirements by December 31st of 2017. And they had to self-attest to meeting those requirements. So again, as the DoD is looking at this, they are not looking at this as new requirements being levied on defense contractors. They're really looking at how they ensure defense contractors meet what they mandated back in 2014. So fast forward to a couple years ago, in July of 2019, the DoD Inspector General came out with a report that said they had found that DoD contractors hadn't consistently implemented the mandated security requirements to safeguard CUI, specifically the NIST 800-171 standard. Later in that same year, then Katie Arrington, who is the CISA for the Undersecretary of Defense, came out with an even stronger message and said that their office actually believed that only 1% of companies in the defense industrial base met all 110 controls of that NIST 800-171 standard. So that's really the genesis for the interim final rule that came out in September of last year and went into effect as of November 30th. It's looking to really put teeth behind the requirement that came out in 2014 under the Obama administration, and it takes the interim final rule takes a 2-pronged approach with 3 new DFARS clauses. The first 2 specifically put teeth behind the NIST 800-171 standard because now defense contractors are required to self-assess and submit a score based on their NIST 800-171 compliance. The remaining DFARS clause, the 252.204-7012 that you see noted at the bottom of the screen, is really the first 2 create a bridge to that cybersecurity maturity model that is required under 7021, but it allows the government to enforce it while getting to that future standard, which will be the state going forward, with third-party companies coming in to actually certify every defense contractor is meeting the appropriate standards. And we'll get into all of those details. So you may be asking yourself, who is affected? all defense contractors and subcontractors are affected by the interim final rule. The only exception is commercial off-the-shelf software. And again, we call out that this presents a really unique challenge for defense manufacturers because of the CNC machines on their shop floor that are integrated into their IT systems. Defense contractors have a unique challenge in that they must consider the security requirements related to both the front office and the back office, the shop floor. So here is a chart that lines up the existing DFARS 252.204-7012 against the 3 new DFARS clauses. I recognize it's a bit of an eye chart, but wanted to walk you through this at a macro level. We'll go through for every DFARS clause, who's required, when it's required, how it's required, what specifically is required, where, if documentation is required, where that needs to be, and how often these requirements will affect your organization. So I think the key thing to highlight here is in the bottom left, you will know there's an orange box. And that absence of information in that box that we created is really the reason for the DFARS clauses. Again, what it means is that the government really has no ability to have visibility into their suppliers to figure out where they stand against these controls, the NIST 800-171 controls, because it's essentially an honor system with self-attestation. So you will note that, again, there is a requirement for a self-assessment to be completed and documented in the government supplier performance risk system. So again, we'll dive into each one of these, but it's really the gap here, that honor system, which the government believes obviously was not working, is the driver behind these changes. So again, 7012, it allows contractors to continue to process and store controlled unclassified information without actually having implemented the NIST 800-171 controls. And it doesn't, and the government has no way to enforce a timeline to get every defense contractor into compliance. So the first 2 DFARS clauses, which will go into effect with any new contract, subcontract, task order, or delivery order, so they go into effect immediately, is really where we're focused today and drawing your attention to the requirement to complete the self-assessment. You will note under 7019 that assessment must be completed and you must have a score, again, in the supplier performance risk system prior to being considered for contract award. 7020 is a DFARS clause that allows the government for really medium and high risk contracts to come into your company and review your self-assessment. This would be done, of course, after contract award, but really is a reason why you must make sure that when you complete that self-assessment, you have thoroughly and accurately documented exactly what controls are in place and have a plan of action and milestones for those that you're working towards with specific dates of when you will be in compliance. So there is a standardized scoring system that the government has come up with for this assessment methodology. The other interesting aspects is the government is very concerned about making sure that this gets driven throughout the entire supply chain. So these DFARS clauses also require that every contractor make sure that their subcontractors have a score posted prior to the award of any subcontract. And you'll note here at the bottom, I have a link to the supplier performance risk system where you must go enter your score. So a little bit more about the government's assessment methodology. It is meant to be very objective. It's based on a weighted assessment. So for all 110 controls, some are assigned a value of 1 point, some 3 points, some 5 points. But the score that you need to enter reflects the net effect of any security requirements not yet implemented. So that's where this is unique. A perfect score would be 110, meaning that you have fully implemented all 110 controls. So you start at 110, and then for any control that is not met, you must deduct the appropriate points based on the value of that control that the government's defined. So again, you start with 110, you have all of the security requirements, and you begin to subtract based on those that are not met. 44 of the controls are worth 5 points, 14 are worth 3 points, and 51 of the controls are worth 1 point. It is possible to have a negative score. We've worked with several companies who have negative scores and where we're planning with them to remediate the various controls that they do not have in place based on the POAM items that we've been working with them to establish. And then very quickly to hop into the CMMC, so the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. This is really the DoD's end goal. But this requires that there are third-party audit firms who are accredited to go out and complete these CMMC audits. And that takes some time. So again, the prior to DFARS clauses are the government's bridge, but this is the ultimate goal where every 3 years as a defense contractor, you will be required to bring in a certified third-party assessing organization who will do a thorough audit of the 130 practices that are required by CMMC. So you will note there is an additional 20 requirements from the 110 NIST controls. The government has pilot proposals and RFPs out on the street now, about 10 that are flowing through the DoD and the supply chain now in terms of meeting the CMMC programs, but it is expected that CMMC will be the de facto standard in all contracts by October 1st, 2025. So just a few 4 years away from now. It's not, it will be here before we know it, and they will be rolling in every year. So while the pilots are in place now, it will continue to roll out over the next 4 years. So again, it's in every contract by that 4th year. So again, just to give you a bit of a sense, I mentioned there are 20 additional practices required by CMMC. This gives you, again, I'm sorry, I apologize, a bit of an eye chart here, but if you look at the left, there are 5 levels to CMMC. It's anticipated that most companies will be required to meet level 3. Level 3, then, if you come into the middle of the chart, shows you the NIST 800-171 controls, of which there are 110. And then if you look over to the far right and see the CMMC column, you will note the additional 20 that make up the total of 130 that will be required for CMMC. So the good news is, again, getting NIST compliant will take you a long way towards meeting the CMMC practices. Also of note, there was a quick update just in the last 2 weeks. There was a new NIST SP 800-172 that was actually published. That's an extension to the current 171 standard, and it is particularly meant to meet level 4 and level 5 CMMC levels, where it's protecting CUI at those higher risk type contracts. And we've added a link into this PowerPoint, and again, we'll send this briefing out to you all, but where you can go up and look in that 172 standard. So bottom line, I wanted to ask Charlie, having submitted our own NIST 800-171 self-assessment, there are some gotchas in terms of how you get into the system and submit your score, and wanted Charlie to walk you through some of the lessons learned from our own as well as our clients trying to get in and enter their self-assessments.
All right. So again, submitting your your score, you're going to need your SSP, your System Security Plan, and your Plan of Action and Milestones, your POAMs. Obviously, if you don't have a POAM, or if you don't have an SSP, then obviously you cannot submit a score. That's the first thing. So you will need to, for a Plan of Action and Milestone, any security control that you have listed as either partially compliant or not compliant, you would have to have a corresponding Plan of Action and Milestone for that security control. And what that entails is how you're going to fix that problem and when it's going to be implemented by. Those are the two important pieces of information for your POAMs. Elizabeth, you can go to the next slide. So what you're going to need. So you'll have to have a PIE account, that stands for Procurement Integrated Enterprise Environment. You have to, once you go in and log in, you'll have to enable the SPRS Cyber Vendor role. That has to be active. You can have that role and it can be listed as inactive, which could cause issues, which it did for us. You'll have to know the date of your assessment, what that score is. So we have listed, for example, 95 out of 110. Note that there can be a negative score. The scope of the assessment, so basically you would have your cage code that you'll have to supply as well. And then again, where I was mentioning the Plan of Action completion date, obviously on that POAM list, you're going to have multiple different POAM items to resolve. Whichever is your latest is what you'll put as your resolution date. So step one is PIE access. So obviously, once you have access, you're going to log in into that landing page, and when you'll go in there and you'll actually go to your roles, which is step 6 in your registration, and there you will go ahead and hit the drop down, select SPRS, and then you should have two options that show up: contractor vendor support role and SPRS cyber vendor user. You'll want to select SPRS cyber vendor user and click add roles. And then if you go to the next page for me, Elizabeth.
Yep. There you go.
So the next page is you'll log in, you'll log back out, and when you log back in, you should have an SPRS icon at the landing page. When you click on that, it'll take you to another system, another page, and on the left-hand side of the left-hand column of the website, you'll actually have a report menu items option, and underneath there it'll say NIST SP 800-171 assessment. So you'll want to click there. And here you'll have your assessment database. You may not have anything listed at all, and that's okay. You may have, other cage codes if you're managing multiples, but they'll all be listed in the header view. From there, you should have a create header option. When you create a header, that is going to allow you to add your assessment. So you'll select your cage code, company name, confidence level. So if you're trying to NIST 800-171, it should be the dropdown that you select. And then after you insert that in for your cage code, where it says version or details view under 3.2, there you'll have the option to add an assessment. And when you click add assessment, which should be on the next page, you will have the ability to put in your entry. So your assessment date, your score, scope, plan of action completion date, and then for the included cage, you should be able to click open cage hierarchy and select all the different cage codes that you have set up within your system, and you'll be able to select the one that's appropriate for this assessment. Click save, and that should get you through there. Troubleshooting tips. So if you don't see a cage code, you may have to, or don't have the create new header button, you may have to contact PIE support, or you'll have to go in and make sure the cyber vendor user is active. When contacting support, there is a way to email them. It has not been responsive at all. Picking up the phone and calling them, you'll be on hold for a little while, and that's okay, but you'll get somebody live that can fix the issue right then and there. Last thing is, if under step 311 you don't see a cage code, it may not have been added to the system, so you'll have to follow the link to the SAM to get that rectified. And SAM stands for System for Award Management.
That's right. So we'll send this briefing out, but this is, again, some helpful links that will hopefully get you through the process. And now to hop into SSE's specific solution set to help companies meet the NIST 800-171 requirements and the CMMC requirements. I think before we hop into it, it's important just to take a step back and realize most people, when they think of cybersecurity, they're thinking firewalls and antivirus, and they're thinking of IT systems. But I think what's really important to note that in order to be compliant to either NIST or CMMC, it's really a full combination of people, policy procedure, as well as IT tools and technical configurations. I think all too many times, again, companies are thinking, oh, I just need to go in and implement X, Y, and Z system. But it's really a robust compliance requirement similar to meeting, for example, an ISO standard. So here you can see for how across the 17 CMMC domains, you will see in the dark gray there, the controls that are administrative, meaning policy or procedures. You will see in the orange those that are technical configurations of your system. So certain controls that you can manage through group policies in your network environment. And then the light gray are actually IT tools that are required to meet the various controls. So SSE, again, having done this for ourselves and for a number of other defense contractors, has done the research and tested out and implemented, again, for ourselves and our customers, 15 different tools that make up our tech stack to meet those requirements, as well as 20 different group policies that can be implemented into your IT environment. And then, in an attempt to really help companies get through this, we have documented and have model policy templates. In fact, there are 57 of them that can be leveraged by companies to get the appropriate policies and procedures in place in order to get to a compliant status. We have all of these bundled, obviously, as one company in an attempt to be the easy button for companies. So diving in a little bit deeper, when we look across the 17 domains and the 130 CMMC controls, you may be asking yourself, where do these 15 different tools set in? What kinds of different tools are required? And you will note here that we have them color-coded and mapped out for you across the various domains. So again, it is the standard that folks think about, everything from spam protection and firewall, but some of the other system requirement that most companies today don't have in terms of mobile device management or intrusion detection and prevention. So again, this is where the 15 tools map out against the CMMC practices. And what's interesting to note, if you don't have this full tech stack, it would be a 90-point deduction from your weighted assessment. Next, I've rolled in the technical configuration, the group policies that I was speaking of. If you do not have the group policies in place managing your network environment, that plus the IT tools would make an 152 point deduction. So now you would be submitting a negative score. And last but not least, without those 50 plus policy templates, and you can see how, again, they fill in here across the 17 domains. The question is really, how will you measure up on your self-assessment? I wanted to take a minute to just talk through some of the complexity associated with the model policy templates that we have. Again, across all 17 domains, you saw how many are required. To just give you a sense of access control, so just one domain, there was actually 50 pages of documentation that was required both as policy and procedure. It's a little hard to read these screenshots, but these are screenshots of our actual model policy templates for the access control policy. And what you will note is at the top, there is actually the policy as well as the corresponding procedures. And what's documented in gray here is for this template, we have calling out specifically by practice what pages require the client to go in and customize the template for their specific environment. So again, this is how we've tried to create something that we could work with any company to get these policies and procedures in place, customized to your specific environment. So I wanted to ask Charlie to speak again for a moment to the unique challenges that manufacturers have when they're looking at this compliance. Charlie, over to you.
All righty. So in a manufacturing environment, obviously you can have shop floor machinery that is very expensive, can be dated a little bit as far as, you might have a machine that's 10, 12 years old. So therefore you may have a computer system that's running on that piece of equipment that may has older operating systems on it. So like a Windows XP or a Windows 7. Or it may have a proprietary system that you can't apply controls to in a managed fashion that would, CMMC would look down upon or look upon as being compliant. So obviously we can tailor changes to CMMC practices, specifically media protection, physical protection, and then system and communications protection. Again, like I had mentioned, most of these machines have shared access. They are using older operating systems like a Windows XP or a Windows 7. So there also are newer machines out there. We've have a couple of clients that have this where they have a operating system that's provided by the manufacturer of the machinery, but it also has wireless access. So obviously that's something that you might have to control. So obviously when we come in and do an investigation of your environment, we'll do that part of that investigation. We'll look at business practices and then determine the best course of action. So that may be data transfer using encrypted or removable media if you can't connect an older system to the network, or if it doesn't have the ability to be connected to the network. There could be network connected transfers where we set up access control lists so that system can only do those transfers and nothing else. So no access to the internet or no access to other systems. Disabling any non-approved network adapters. That's where I was mentioning the wireless adapters before. And then controlled access and monitoring of access to the machinery. So if that's a machine that is, has shared access by multiple users, maybe that means you have video surveillance of the system to make sure that you're only having approved people coming in and out of that, that area where that machine's being used. Or if it's a machine that's small enough that can be in a room that's secured, that's an option as well.
All right. Charlie, thank you. Appreciate it. So now if you're looking at how do I plan for this? What are the appropriate steps if I'm trying to take this in and think about how I get my company to a compliant state? We've got that broken down into 4 easy steps. The first one, obviously, and I'm a big motto of the proper planning prevents poor performance. So it would really be to take a step back and allow SSE to come in, conduct a readiness assessment so that you could put together a high-level plan in terms of how you are going to attack getting to a compliant state. So this would include coming in, assessing a high-level assessment of the current environment and your future needs via a simple survey, determining with you what level of CMMC compliance is needed, reviewing your existing SSP and POEMs, as Charlie mentioned, if you have them and if that's possible, and then really trying to set out a roadmap for compliance to NIST and CMMC with what I know everybody cares about, and I cared about internally, what the budgetary requirements were going to be to get to a compliant state. And we would suggest, like anything, starting that now so that you have a plan, and particularly with those POAM items, you know how long it might take you to get to a compliant state, because you want to make sure that if you have contracts coming up for renewal, that you've got to score in well in advance of those contracts. Second is obviously taking a deeper dive from that readiness assessment and conducting a full-blown gap analysis. So this would require us to come in and work with you to establish and document what the system boundaries would be, review in detail the existing policies and procedures, as well as your current IT and physical environments, assessing the evidence, again, that you have collected in terms of your SSP and POAM items, documenting where the gaps exist, and ultimately we would provide you with a security assessment report as well as the POAM items. This is what you would need in order to go in and complete a self-assessment. So once you have that gap assessment done and you know exactly what gaps you need to remediate, a remediation project would be to complete all the policies and procedures, again, leveraging SSC's model policy templates. We would be working closely with you to customize them to your particular environment, as well as implementing our 15 tools or whatever are required in your environment to have that full tech stack, as well as the group policies. And finally, of course, as Charlie mentioned, related to the CNC machines, if you have older machines or older software in your environment that will not allow you to get to a compliant state, we could work with you to get those servers and workstations upgraded and hardware and software installed to get to a compliant state. The net result of that remediation project would be a final system security plan. And finally, many companies that we're working with recognize that their IT resources are already tapped out. So to layer these requirements on top of that IT staff is really a challenge, as well as the fact that we know there's a lack of cybersecurity experts in the United States today. So many of those IT resources may not have the cybersecurity knowledge and expertise to perform the ongoing compliance and actually understand how to react to the various alerts from the ongoing monitoring of your system. We have a cybersecurity as a service offering where, again, if we've implemented our tech stack and our GPOs, we have the tools to be able to continuously monitor those tools and remediate them, and if an issue comes up, as well as collect the ongoing evidence that's required in order to maintain compliance. So when those third-party auditors or the DoD comes in and is looking for the evidence, some of which needs to be collected weekly, some of which needs to be collected monthly, other things quarterly, it's a rigorous compliance standard. So again, that burden on existing IT resources can be tremendous. So by outsourcing that, again, we will be collecting that evidence for you and maintaining the records that you need to get through a successful audit. And of course, we recommend as part of it that internal self-assessment to the standard is conducted by every company at least annually, and we would be standing by to help support that kind of internal self-assessment. So again, bringing the third party in will be required every 3 years, but you don't want to wait till that last year to make sure that everything is operating as it should and that you've been collecting the evidence along the way that those auditors are going to expect to see. So we have a couple quick polling questions. We thought this feedback would be interesting to you to see how some of the fellow attendees of the webinar are responding. Given the interim final rule, we are curious how many of you have already submitted your DoD scored self-assessment. Okay, so as we thought, and I'm sure no surprise to you all, about 70% of you have not yet submitted a self-assessment score. If you haven't, or follow up to that, if you haven't submitted your DoD self-assessment score, so those 68% of you, do you believe that you're internally prepared to complete that self-assessment? And the 3 possible answers are unsure, yes, or no. We'll give you a moment to respond. Okay, again, so interestingly, about a quarter say yes, they feel prepared to handle it internally. The remaining 75% are either unsure or no. We again find that when we're working with companies, one of the biggest issues if they're trying to do it internally, when they're reading those controls and practices for the first time, they're not intuitive by any stretch of the imagination. And even though the DoD has tried to provide guidance, oftentimes what we find trips folks up the most is just really trying to read that control and interpret exactly what the DoD is looking for you to do in order to be in compliance. Okay, so our last polling question. Do you believe your organization is prepared to handle and maintain the cybersecurity compliance on an ongoing basis? Again, unsure, yes or no. Okay, again, so 60% who've said they're unsure or no, do not feel like they'd be able to maintain the cybersecurity compliance. That's again consistent with what we're finding. Now there are cases where some companies have decided that their IT folks are prepared to do some small aspects of it, but by and large, companies look at these when they get done writing all those policies and procedures and say, you know, be better to outsource and ensure we maintain our compliance because there is a ton of detail, as we noted, to maintain compliance. So last but not least, we mentioned at the beginning, really talking about what the risks are of non-compliance. And today we're joined by Jack Walbrand of Bryan Cave here in St. Louis. Jack, would you mind talking through the risks of non-compliance?
We're moving beyond the obvious possibilities of lost revenue and inability to secure future contracts. In my view, this new set of regulations creates a very substantial False Claims Act risk for contractors. The analysis is straightforward. A statement made which is material to a contract claim is a false claim if the statement is false or in reckless disregard of the truth or in deliberate ignorance of the truth. Statements made to induce new contracts are by definition material. So when you look at this new rule against the background of DoD's inability to understand where it was, uncertainty as to whether it could rely on the contract commitments the contractors were making, they crafted this new clause, and it is crafted to get contractors' attention. Under the clause, expressly, in order to be considered for an award, that is to induce an award, an offeror must, quote, verify, close quote, a current self-scoring of its systems and provide a brief description of the system architecture, the system security architecture, and including the verification, a date that it expects to complete. It's generally accepted, and it's called out in the DAM scoring methodology, that you need an SSP and a POAM in order to support credible scoring and credible time to complete statements. It seems to me that the false statement risk of knowing or reckless statements as to your score or as to your data completion, I think the false statement risk is obvious. What's the extent of the risk? Well, $5,000 to $10,000 penalties per statement, plus 3 times the damage to the government, which in the case of an inducement of a contract is 3 times the total contract value.
Wow.
Spells out why I think there is a substantial False Claims Act risk in these new rules. Thank you.
Jack, thank you. Thank you for underscoring that risk. I think at the bottom of the screen or at the top, you should be able to submit questions. Bob, you can walk us through any questions that have come in so far.
Thanks, Elizabeth. There's been a few that Greg and Charlie have been answering throughout the presentation, a few left over that I'll direct to a few of the panelists. The first one, if I currently use an outside IT provider, do they also need to be certified for CMMC at the same level I do? Charlie, I'm going to direct this one to you if you could please help answer that.
The short answer is yes. An MSP or a service provider would be underneath, they would become part of your supply chain. So therefore, flow down rules would make it so they would have to be under the same level of certification that you are. So let it be 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, they would have to have the same level.
Thank you, Charlie. Jack, I believe this one, given what you just spoke about, would be best served with your answering. To what extent do I need documentation once I submit a NIST self-assessment?
Bob, it's kind of it's a restatement. You really can't have a credible score and a credible completion date without having an SSP and POAMs on paper.
Got it. Thank you, Jack. Greg, I'm going to ask if you could please tackle this one. Could you talk a little bit about both the money as well as the time involved in setting up the IT tools needed to meet CMMC requirements?
Yes, absolutely. I will tell you that time is the greater of challenges, though that there would be a significant upfront expense, as many of the tools have an incurred implementation cost, as well as the ongoing cost of support and reporting. If I had a rough estimate on that upfront cost, if it were one location with roughly, say, 50 people, you'd be looking at anywhere between 50 and 75,000. That said, there are a lot of considerations in the tool selection process. We have selected our tools through months of research, discussions, and conversations between our group having the expertise of Charlie for the technical side, the expertise of Jack from the legal aspect, and ensuring that their end user license agreements would be, in fact, ITAR compliant, which is hand in hand with NIST or CMMC compliance regulations. But it's a labor of love that once you dive in, but you will spend quite a lot of time in the tool selection and vetting process.
Gotcha. Thank you, Greg. Another question, would a gap assessment include information that would help with my NIST self-assessment as well as information on CMMC? Sorry, Greg, do you want to answer that one, please?
I'm sorry. I apologize. I started looking. We got a whole lot of open questions, and I missed the question that you were asking.
Oh, sorry. Does a gap assessment include information that would help with my NIST self-assessment as well as CMMC?
Yes, we would be able to give guidance on the NIST 800-171 scoring against the DoD scoring methodology and review that information with you to ensure that everybody is on the same page. But yes, our assessment would provide that information to allow you to update your scoring.
Gotcha. We are getting a lot more questions here towards the end coming in. Jack, I'm going to ask if you could speak to this one. Is there a minimum score required in addition to POAMs from the self-assessment to secure a new contract?
At this point, there is no minimum score. It is not at all clear how the scoring is going to be evaluated, but either the government or the prime contractor or higher tier contractor can be expected to take into account your scoring and your projected completion date in measuring your responsibility as a contractor and considering whether or not they can safely award to you.
Got it. Thank you, Jack. Charlie, I'm going to direct this one to you. There's another question asking, should all departments, I'm assuming within that company, meet the requirements? HR and marketing doesn't have any impact on CMMC certification, ? I'm assuming the answer to this is going to be the presence of the CUI and who has access to it, but I'll let you take it from there, please.
That is correct. So if the CUI is contained in an enclave where those departments cannot have the ability to gain access to it, then no, those departments would not have to be secured to that level. But if you're talking like just a standard regular open network and you have, let's say it's a file server and you have, files shared on there, just because that system is able to be accessed by those machines, maybe those people don't have access to the CUI on the machines, but they still have access to that machine, then you would still have to secure all systems to that level of certification for CMMC. Hopefully that's a clear answer.
Yeah, so I think it's really important to, that's part of what we would do in upfront is come up with the system boundaries. Is that what you're saying, to kind of?
Correct. And if you think about most networks, most people in the past, when they would build a network, it would just have, you'd have all of your network resources, your servers, and, people would have those access to those things secured with, security permissions or something like that. That's not good enough to CMMC. You need to prove that those people cannot in any way access that data. So when we're looking at, let's say, for example, there's an environment that has 10 machines and only one of those machines has the CUI, we can look at building a separate enclave to secure it to where only that machine, there's no way for anybody else to access that machine. Now you're limiting your scope, and you're also limiting your liability to just that one machine. So it's also going to lower your costs as well. So it's obviously something to think about. And then, like when we go in and do an assessment, we give recommendations based on what we find.
So it may cost a little more upfront to build out that enclave, but the ongoing expense in terms of maintaining compliance.
Correct.
Okay, great.
Just about at noon, there are a couple other questions that also had to do with enclaving and cloud that I believe we addressed with the other questions, but we'll also follow up directly after this. And just a reminder that we will be sending out a recording of this webinar to all registrants and attendees, so you will get all of this information as well.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for attending. And Jack, Charlie, Greg, Bob, thank you for your help in making the webinar so productive today. Bob's contact information is here on the screen now. We would love to be a resource. Any question you have, please feel free to reach out, and just want to thank you all for attending again and your time. We look forward to being in touch. Thank you so much. Have a great day.